Hello and welcome to part 5 of the commentary for High Performance Imports V7. This is the last part. This was mostly filmed in Adelaide and at the AIR drag strip. In 2003, Australia was certainly a little bit behind Japan in terms of drag GTRs, but we were improving quite quickly, and here we've got a couple of the best cars at the time.
In Australia, some local workshops are rapidly catching up to the Japanese street GTR times. This R33, built by Tilbrook Auto and Dyno, is beautifully prepared with a race fuel cell in the boot.
Tilbrook did a lot of the work on this car. It'd be very hard to pick out which things they did and which they didn't. But it's got an OS-Gekken 3-litre long motor. So everything from the head down was built by OS-Gekken, while the head prep was all done locally. At this point, I think they'd only just fitted a twin 2835R turbo kit, which was really quite small for that motor. I mean, you could happily put 3240s or something like that on it, but I think they were working their way up to that.
The engine is an OS-Gekken 3-litre with a modified Greddy inlet manifold carrying a single 100mm throttle. A pair of HKS 2835R turbos seems small for this engine, but it produces the numbers. The Motec CDI ignition system fires Mercury outboard coils. Both the CDI and M800 computer were mounted side by side, but were...
The Mercury coils were an interesting idea. They did some testing on them and found that they outperformed the other coils that people tended to use on GTRs. So whether or not it made a lot of difference in the end, who knows? But they were certainly very powerful coils.
were later moved apart to avoid interference. The doors are still metal, but when prepared this way, they weigh the same as fiberglass items.
It's quite a nice setup they did there with the rods welded on to keep the shape of the door, when really all you've got there is a door skin with a perspex window.
The transmission is a sequential Hollinger 6-speed, while the dash carries only the essential warnings, such as a panic light. Surprisingly, this car still runs a full-length exhaust.
This is John Munro's car. When he started out, it was actually a super clean example of an R33, really nice street car, but things got a bit out of hand.
The suspension is also only modified with bolt-on parts. The front part of the transmission is disabled for testing on a two-wheel drive dyno.
Being an R33, I think they actually took out the prop shaft, like the front prop shaft, to make sure there was no torque going to the front wheels. See, in Japan they use sandbags. Back then in Australia, if you wanted to keep the wheels on the dyno, you just threw all the other workshop staff in there. don't know if you noticed the guy in the who was standing next to the engine bay with a long breaker bar in his hand. Um, what they used to do is hold that against part of the engine and hold the other end close to your ear, and you could hear if there was any detonation. Good old-fashioned way to do it.
The fine tuning for a race meeting. It makes 520 kilowatts at the rear wheels.
Let's have a look at that last run, eh?
This is Martin Donnan, who was very well known in the scene back then and now. And he used to do a lot of tuning at Toolbrook back then. As you can see, this is actually the telemetry, if you like, from the Motec ECU, which was a lot more fancy than what most people were using in Australia back then.
Which will be this one here. Zoom in. See the throttle position is 100%. Let's have a look at our boost. At it. Okay, we're getting up to 1.85 actual bar. That's absolute pressure, so it reads 285 kPa. It's 1.85 bar or about 26 pounds off the top of my head. With this power, that probably will be the limit of those turbochargers. So
yeah, it's nearly 27 psi, which is probably about as hard as you can run those turbos before you start dropping off a cliff for the efficiency.
I think we'll pretty much leave it there. We're getting up to 85% duty cycle on the injectors. They're 1000 cc. So we should, when you get the fuel pressure, the duty we're running, the size of the injectors, you can quite happily calculate back. We're making around 750 to 800 horsepower at the crankshaft, which is around the 700 horsepower at the wheels. So yeah, I'm pretty happy with what it's nice looking.
Yeah, it was about 700 at the wheels, which on a Dyno Dynamics dyno back then, there was a bit of argument about how much you had to calculate back to work out the flywheel horsepower. I did a few calculations before when I watched this video before, and I think it was probably closer to 840 horsepower at the flywheel, which again is just nearing the limit of what those turbos could do.
At Adelaide International Raceway, owner John Munro put it to the test.
Fastest time for the day, 7:87 at 173 miles an hour. But I can tell you, if you're sitting early, you can work out this Adelaide track. That machine is going to go pretty fast. Yeah, so far we have a few problems on the start line. No, we're all okay, and
For a few minutes, this was the fastest street GTR in Australia. Then its arch rival came along. Key Wilson's R32 also uses an OS Geekin engine and Hollinger transmission, but with Truss TD06 turbos and the original 6-throttle system.
Now, these turbos are really kind of small for an RB32. They were TD06 20G, so not the larger 25G, which is equivalent of a T67, which is more what you'd see people using in Japan at the time.
As you will hear, it also has an open exhaust system.
our little speed shot once again. Get down here, folks, check it out, because things are going real quick. And I'm not sure, I don't believe it, but there might be only a few caps left. Up to you guys. The R32 couple of turbos hanging off, and it sounds absolutely awesome. That real hard Kia Wilson in the R32 Skyline. Let's see the time at the end of the track. 9:51, 150 miles an hour, ladies.
Did eventually get that car into the high 8s from memory, and the mile per hour got up to about 165 or something. Personally, I think it could have gone even better with a bit more work on the launch, but certainly at the time it was well and truly the quickest GTR in Australia.
Yes, a 9:51 out of the R32, I tell you what.
An entirely different style of Skyline was trailered down from Queensland for the event.
Sub-Zero Performance have a bit of an interesting history. I'm not going to comment on it here, but you can look it up if you like. The day before this was shot, they tried tuning the car on the dyno with slicks on the back, which is a really, really bad idea because they exploded. The problem with running slicks on a dyno is that the tyres don't have steel belting in them like you'll find in a radial tyre. And as they expand and heat up, they can quite often just explode on the dyno. And both of them blew up on this car and bits of rubber went all over the place. Unfortunately, I wasn't filming that day.
The Sub-Zero R33 GTS uses a local RB30 type crank with custom rods and pistons and an RB26 head.
I think it was a Garrett TA45, which was a popular big cheap turbo back then. It's also got a Microtech computer, which was a relatively cheap computer, although it was very successful in drag racing. If you knew what you were doing, you could get good results from them. Also had, I think, a 3-speed automatic with a ratchet shifter on it.
The big Garrett turbo was helped by a shot of nitrous on the track, but on the dyno it was turbo only. Through automatic transmission, it produced 500 kilowatts at the wheels, which proved to be a bit too much for the 10-inch slick tyres on the day.
It may have been a 2-speed power glide they were running. So it made basically the same power as Munro's car, but it had to put it through only 2 tyres. And I seem to remember they locked up the rear suspension, like replaced the shocks with solid rods, so it had no rear suspension at all, which may not have been such a good idea. I can't remember if they actually ran a decent time, but certainly that car needed a bit more work on setup. Anyway, that's it for High Performance Imports V7. I'll be coming back soon with High Performance Imports V8, which was one of my top 3 favorite videos that I produced. So please subscribe and come back and watch that one. Cheers.